actually, there is a couple good steak places.
Francis. I put you on the list to have dinner with Cisneros for our hybrid. You weren't on the list previously.
No,
You had
except
signed up.
that I have been in Ernie Cortez's study group, and Adela told me his class, the class that the IOP had.
Yeah. Well, I looked on the list that was on the guest list, and you weren't on it.
Okay.
So I added you to it from the thug standpoint. And that's my way of saying thanks for all your help.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And it's a pleasure, really, and I haven't done anything.
Oh, yes, yeah. Well, you're not done. I'm going to get more work out of you yet.
You will. Good.
All right.
Yeah. Women were about 50 years old, 50 to 60. Turns out Big Al is a double-decker stripper with girls stripping on the bottom and men stripping on the top. Can you imagine? So it's like a family thing. Right through upstairs, just stay down.
I was part of the editing of it. In fact, we're next to each other. That's great. No. It was.
See, I brought this so I can wave this.
Thank you very much.
All the mayors got a copy. We bought copies for all the mayors.
Thank you. That's great. I appreciate it. In fact, I used to work a lot with Coleman.
Didn't want to educate.
But I knew about you through my law students and my law faculty. For some reason, you were very.
Still talking.
What happened? They invited me to come up and get Harrison resident, and I got struck by the students and professional.
Well, you sure did, because I was mayor when you were.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. May I have your attention, please? Good evening. Thank you very much, and welcome to the forum of the Institute of Politics. I'm Charles Royer, the director of the Institute. I'm very pleased to recognize in our group tonight some of the new mayors who are here for the seminar for newly elected mayors, which is something the Institute does every 2 years. Mayors of the larger American cities come together to try to figure out from their colleagues, in conversations with their new colleagues and with former mayors and faculty from the Kennedy School and Harvard University, figure out the transition to try to find ways to maximize the benefits and opportunities of the transition, and also to try to avoid the pitfalls of that very delicate move from campaigning to governing. We have something like, we have mayors representing almost 6 million people, budgets of nearly $8 billion in the seminar, and we're very hopeful about their contribution to America's cities. We're going to discuss some issues having to do with the future of urban America. We're going to key off the book Citistates, which Neil Pierce, Curtis Johnson, and John Hall have produced, How Urban America Can Prosper in a Competitive World. Let me start by just saying that in Seattle today, President of the United States and the leaders of the Pacific Rim trading nations, the nations which will make up over the next decade probably half of the world's economic growth, are meeting in Seattle to talk about how to advantage each other in that Pacific Rim trading arena. It's no accident they're meeting in Seattle. For many years, the city of Seattle has had as a target, as a goal, the creation of a region of influence in the Pacific Northwest involving 2 Canadian provinces, 5 states, 4 major cities with deep water ports, to try to become an international player in a very changed international economy, to become a regional influence, in other words, in a new global economy. That's what Neil, in part, was writing about in this book, Citistates, the emergence, the decline some of nation states, the emergence of city-states who will be competitors in a very changed global economy. We'll ask Neil to start off and lay the groundwork for this issue, and then ask our 2 respondents, Dennis Archer, the newly elected mayor of Detroit, who is one of our seminar participants, and George Latimer, who is working with Henry Cisneros at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. George is the former mayor of St. Paul. I'll ask Neil Pierce to lead it off. Neil is a contributing editor at National Journal and a syndicated newspaper columnist. He is probably the major authority in the country on state and local government. Neil has been in the trenches writing on cities and states and local issues and urban issues for many, many years. And those of us who have worked in those difficult vineyards always turn to Neil to find out what is new, what is happening, what's on the cutting edge in the country in terms of urban America. So we're very pleased that Neil can be with us tonight to lead us off on the subject of city-states and the new economic competitiveness that they represent for the United States. Neil Pierce.
Well, Charlie, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be sitting on Mayor's Row here. Having covered you in the past and George in the past and Mayor Archer in the future. Classy bunch, so I feel very, very lucky to be with all of you. I think to get the tone set, quick and simple message in one sense, that across the globe, certainly across our country, the age of the city-state is upon us, and we had best be ready for it. The way I like to think about it is to suggest that you're on an imaginary trip on a spaceship, and you're approaching planet Earth, and it's night, and you see these fingers of light, mostly around the edges of the continents, where human beings congregate in great number. And then you circle in on one of them, and daylight breaks, and you see a whole constellation of activity, except no municipal boundary is visible. All you see is this agglomeration of human beings, traffic, movement, everything that makes up for a great metropolitan region. But there's nothing there to suggest in that vision all the lines that the municipal authorities put on the maps for you to think are really the most important defining parts of our world. This is what people mostly call metropolitan areas. The Europeans have a terrible name for it. It's a conurbation. I prefer to call it the city-state, the closely intertwined, interrelated, geographic, economic, environmental entity that really defines the civilization of our time. A couple of weeks ago, my colleagues and I wrote what we would like to put into the dictionaries in a few years. It's our dictionary definition of city-state, spelled our new way as one word with a small I, all put together, a little bit like Citibank with no apologies. But our definition will be city-state, a region consisting of one or more historic center cities surrounded by cities and towns which have a shared identification, function as a single zone for trade, commerce, and communication, and are characterized by social, economic, and environmental interdependence. And then we say, like in italics in the dictionary, hist for history, similar to city-states of antiquity, that is Athens and Carthage, or medieval times, Italian city-states or the Hanseatic League, except that modern city-states engage in instant electronic communication and capital transfer and are the chief recipients of world population growth. Now, if you listen to the dictionary definition we'd like to sell, there's no mention of borders, boundaries, municipalities, or government within the way that we define it. Dan Kemmis, the mayor of Missoula, Montana, has taken to claiming that his city of 43,000 is the center of a city-state. And you might find that preposterous, but he says he looked at Missoula on the map and then he started drawing lines out. How far does our newspaper circulate? Our radio and TV signal go? How far do people come in for medical care or retailing or other relationships? Drew an average circle about 200 miles wide because there's not much close to Missoula, and he says that's the city-state, and that's the natural organic form of human activity, and the nation-state for 400 or 500 years cut us out of seeing what the real human association is before you start drawing these artificial boundaries upon the map. When you think about city-states, it's true that demographics, this big population move is part of it. I think that the technological part is very important. Telecommunications, money transferred, generated in one city-state financial center, transferred within seconds across boundaries without permission of any national government. Investment capital moving extremely rapidly. Trade barriers crumbling. What a week to talk about that with the NAFTA approval. But as the Europeans are learning, that means the nation state can do less to subsidize and sustain politically favored industries and regions. Central governments finding it tougher and tougher to keep a handle on their own currency. Nation states losing control of movements of people, of the immigration that comes in and out of them in many large respects. These great urban agglomerations of the world becoming, in a way, a united nations, because all of them have a little bit of almost every ethnic group in the world, it's seeming. And finally, nation states sinking in relative influence because the one activity they were best at, which was organizing huge armies to march across the face of the globe and conduct war, becomes a somewhat irrelevant function with the end of the Cold War, when what we really need are more like military police actions. So that means, in my view, that the new definition of what's happening in the world is economic, not military. I don't need to point out to all of you that city-states were there long before there were nation-states, all the way back to antiquity. The nation-states were somewhat newcomers. We'll continue to need nation-states for social safety nets for the poor, or social security system, or air safety. But no natural law of history says the dominance of any form is assured for all time to come. And today you look across the world and you see forces, economic, political, and tribal, tearing apart these once secure borders of nationhood, and central authority almost everywhere weakening. I got onto the study of what was happening with our metro regions really seriously, doing a series of articles commissioned one by newspapers across the country, starting back in 1986 for Phoenix to look at that region, then Seattle, Baltimore, Dallas, St. Paul. This year I've just completed doing one on the Triangle region, Raleigh-Durham and North Carolina. I'm writing one on Spokane now with my colleagues. And we find that when you look at a region and really try to think, instead of city or suburb, truly regionally, all sorts of new things come into focus, or things that come into a new focus. The land use issue transfers from local zoning disputes to the question of the physical shape and the environment of the whole region, how decisions are made about where people work and live and recreate, and is land being used as a resource, conserving what one has before you use up more. The image of the center of the cities becomes a way of defining that city-state for the whole world. The image is in the downtown, and that's what people around the world know. So everyone in the city-state needs to think the image of that downtown, how well it does, is vitally important, and it's not just a question for a few downtown business leaders to worry about. Government efficiency and effectiveness, when you think regionally, becomes an international competitive issue. It begins with the labor force. Can employers find the people they need to hire in enough time with adequate education and training at affordable wages? Transportation. Can goods and people be moved across the region in timely, cost-effective fashion? Or are they caught on clogged roads and inadequate capacity? Infrastructure, or the roads and bridges and water systems that undergird our economy, getting the maintenance that they require. The environment, our issues of toxicity, hazardous solid waste, water supply, contamination, clean air? Is all of that getting the attention it needs? Now, the interesting thing is that all of those questions, which are the major ones of governance, are regional in scope. Single municipalities may affect them, but they cannot determine them or really strategically plan about them because they lack the authority to do that. And all this does matter economically. In the past, an industry might be able to get along with an inadequate labor force or weak transportation links or a pretty bad local environment. But this protective envelope of time and space has been exploded. Every monopoly in the world today is under challenge. Enterprises are able to move quickly around countries, sometimes globally, with very short notice. So unless you address the issues of governance on a regional basis, you may lose your competitive edge in the world economy. Social issues in this formulation, I think, become an issue of looking at people who are now in social difficulty or trouble and saying, how can they be helped forward and help themselves forward so they become regional assets, almost like a corporation will look at its liabilities and say, how can that become an asset for us? Crime and public safety become regional issues when the center city is threatened by lawlessness and floods of guns, and when drive-by shootings and assaults and gangs start to seep out across the whole region, even begin to set its image to other places, as we now see that kind of thing spreading into many of our regions. School and university issues now have to be viewed in the context of regional workforce preparedness, and we have to ask the strategic question, are the schools and their performance, are the technical schools, the community colleges, the institutions of higher learning, do they form collectively an adequate base to educate the people in this region so that the region can be competitive? My concern is American city-states are suffering from three very serious disabilities which are not in large part borne by their keen competitors in Asia and Europe. The first is clearly this very deep socioeconomic gulf between poor cities and affluent suburbs. And I think that we only need to look back to the Los Angeles riots last year to see a metaphor about how that matters to everyone who lives within the city-state. When we had the riots in the 60s in Los Angeles, contained to one neighborhood or set of neighborhoods. But last year's rainbow eruption had an effect that radiated out quickly and fiercely. Hollywood, Pasadena, Long Beach, San Bernardino were involved, and then the economy. Fears quickly arose about Asian and European capital bolting, fear of losing billions in Japanese tourist investment. Every person in that region was affected by those disturbances. Nor is the problem any longer one of center cities alone. There's been some very interesting research by the National League of Cities, by some well-known academics, by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, which shows that in regions, or as I call them, city-states, when the center city has a very low per capita income, the suburban incomes are depressed. When the center city income is higher, why then the suburban incomes tend to be higher. So suburbanites may feel they're protected because they're in what look like a safe suburb, but they aren't necessarily. We also have some new research done by Tom Beyer of Cleveland State University, which shows that property values in the older communities are declining as one wave after the other of residential development goes further out, and that in time the fiscal crises we've seen for the cities will be fiscal crises of entire urban counties. That relates to the next peril to American city-states: physical sprawl, devouring farmlands and open spaces at a ferocious rate, and consequences that are not only environmental, and we all know about those with air quality and so on, but also the fact that as the job locations go farther and farther out there, we create, in effect, an American apartheid with some of the people who need the jobs most desperately not able to get to them. We're also clearly, if you want to take the sprawl issue, wasting an immense amount of our national capital, which may be in short supply as the rest of the world is no longer anxious to lend to cover our deficit habits, an immense amount of our capital on physical duplication of facilities that already exist when we really need that capital for productive investment in new technologies, education, job training. I think, finally, American city-states are dismally ineffective in any kind of coordinated governance. governments that are at 6s and 7s, very rarely cooperating with each other, passing off problems one to the other, and the international image is then of a malfunctioning and divisive city-state. So I've been asking myself, if you take stock of all of this, where most American regions stand at the start of the city-state age, what's going to stop us from changing, and what will help us to adapt? What are the trends that we see today? So I first thought, what are the trends that are, or the factors that are stopping change, making it impossible for us to break the glacial age of sort of indifference and lack of communication and cooperation across our city-states? You have to start, I think, in 1993 with fear of crime. The waves of murders and associated assaults puts a real chill on city-suburban cooperation. And the tools to cope with that crime, which would be intensive work with troubled families and assisting the neighborhoods under assault take command of their own future and community policing, all of that is going to take a long time to get into place adequately. We face the increasing stratification and separation of American society by race and income group and nationality, which many demographic studies are showing. We have the rapidity of global economic change driving us to a bipolar society of haves and have-nots, which deprives us of some of the breathing space we could use to make accommodations. We clearly have a lack of a national agenda to face the problems of cities. Look at the almost zero reaction of the federal and the California state government to the Los Angeles disturbances. We have federal tax policy that continues to foster sprawl development, building further and further out. We have many businesses that still equate economic development with the consumption of land. We have suburbanites who still think that it's cost-free. A lot of home rule and parochialism, and we still have among politicians and academics and the media alike a belief that since we've had a frozen, glacier-like situation in terms of any kind of real cooperation, center city and suburban, for the last generation, it can't change. We're going to stay that way. What's for change? Well, I think American industries are running into extraordinarily heavy waters in international competition and beginning to think that we need some new approaches. There's a great deal of concern about the workforce of the future. Growing proportions of that workforce are going to be young people of color or others who are not on the escalator of American opportunity. And where will industries find their workforce, people with sufficient analytic capacity and skills to operate in a very competitive international climate? And so thoughtful industries are worrying very hard about that problem. It becomes thinkable, even in this kind of a context, as Connecticut did recently, to say we'll have to do away with our ferocious every town for itself system and set up a system. I think there's 6 or 8 districts in the state to look at the future of education and finding ways to overcome the immense disparities of incomes and outputs between your wealthy suburban towns and your depressed and very poor inner cities. I think there is, as part of that, sort of a growing public consciousness that urban problems can't be contained forever. We had the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 and ICE-T, the federal transportation legislation, first laws of the city-state era, and a belief that we have to start getting some dialogue going across metropolitan regions on real issues. One would be to look at the fact that many of the federal environmental regulations simply aren't working, and we need to bargain out on a regional basis where we would go with that. We have some new politics that's forming that's sort of interesting. Myron Orfield, a state legislator in Minnesota, has taken this up. He's from the city of Minneapolis. And he claims that not only are there major problems in the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, which we all used to think, George, were problem-free, but the number of the inner ring suburbs on the southern flank and the northern flank of Minneapolis and St. Paul are getting into serious trouble today, some of them declining faster than the center city is. This is causing a vast preponderance of new jobs and commercial development to go out to a fertile crescent of outer ring, fast-growth suburbs, which are at most a quarter of the population of the region, so that a new politics might be possible. There are more have-nots or more or less gainers than it used to look like. It no longer needs to be the center city versus all the suburbs. It can be the center city and other places that have real problems today in our society together with the center city. A majority of municipalities in the Twin Cities region, seeing their plight, have petitioned to have an elected regional council, and even people in some of the outer suburbs are asking if they can long prosper with rings of decay creeping towards them. I think big city mayors are giving up some of their opposition to regionalism. I think Mayor Archer's election succeeding Coleman Young is a symbol of that, and he may have something to say to you about that. Across America, we have a virtual outpouring of efforts at regional goal setting and business-citizen cooperation and partnerships. We have a handful of councils of governments recognizing that just meetings of government officials won't do it, that they have to form some pretty broad partnerships with business and citizens for leadership development and setting some regional goals. The debate we're now having is different from the debate we had in the 60s and the early 70s. Back then, metropolitanism was how do you deliver services more efficiently? How do you create a public administration perfect metropolitan structure? I think today the question is quite different. It's how do our regions remain competitive? How do we prevent our shared social and environmental and economic problems from overwhelming us? We had a meeting of the National Civic League, or I was at one, which I take part in last weekend in Atlanta, and one of the regional specialists from Pittsburgh said, you know, we're organized in the United States to handle things at 3 levels: federal government, state government, and city-county. And he said the emerging and toughest problems are sort of different. They're international, they're regional, and they're neighborhood. And I thought there was quite a bit in that. The international means our economic performance simply has to increase. The writing off whole cities and neighborhoods and classes of people will never get us. It will be almost suicidal course to be competitive in the world economy. The regional means we must begin to plan and strategize and rationalize at efforts on the city-state level. And the neighborhood means that I think we must address people's deep distrust, disconnect with government, alienation, by providing ways for them to participate and have a voice at the very local level where they live. The latest report we've done for Spokane, we're considering suggesting sort of a Spokane model. There they could have a combined city-county government, do away with all the old county row officers and county commissioners, have an executive structure for a combined city-county government, but at the same time, a very formalized or quite formalized set of relationships which make the neighborhoods part of governance for themselves, with neighborhood councils of some type, regular county, city reports to the neighborhoods on how they're doing, and a connection with the elected system. How do we get the variety of skills and analysis and fresh ideas and impetus our city-states need to make it? I think that issue is especially complex in an era in which most corporations seem to have lost their corporate rootedness. We used to count on them a lot. I was thinking again this weekend, what are the things that really have to be within a community that can't leave, that are the institutions we can think of as our root of planning for the future? And I put down utilities. The power company can't leave town. It can't go off and start a branch operation somewhere and change its headquarters very easily. The newspapers and TV, they might try to leave, but they can't very well because they're stuck where the people are. Universities. I think universities are the great sort of untapped resource that we need to think of on a community and a regional basis. And I just finished doing a report for the Triangle region in North Carolina where I focused on the potential of universities to do a mobilization of their capacities, looking at the challenges of a society with growing economic and racial division. Finally, I think a region's own people are one of the great assets, and that we need to help them to coalesce into some kinds of cohesive regional citizen organization which would match the city-state reality and find some ways to think through the major public policy challenges across the geographic and racial and ethnic and income lines of a region. When we're able to do that, and when foundations and the progressive corporations and the universities and the media buy into the idea that you must indeed have regional planning, or at least visioning, and that there must be a citizen role in it, then I think we'll be better positioned to look forward. I've been using the language of economics and global positioning to try and focus a city-state debate because economics is the overwhelming language of our time that everybody understands and reacts to. But I think underneath it, the fundamental issues remain what they've always been. They're very societal and they're moral.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. I apologize for the noise. There's another dinner going on upstairs, and I apologize for the rudeness of the noise. There's not much we can do about it. It's ending at 6:30, allegedly, so we'll be free of that. But thanks for bearing with us on that. The forum is an active place with lots of voices. Usually we like to have them on the floor here as opposed to the other place. George Latimer is the Director of Special Projects for the Department of Housing and Urban Development for the Secretary, Henry Cisneros, another mayor, great mayor of San Antonio. George was the mayor of St. Paul, and all of us looked to him for innovative solutions, and now he's seeking out innovative collaborations and partnerships and working on those for Henry Cisneros. And we're all in this business very pleased to have him there. George, if you and Dennis would take about 5 minutes to respond, and then we'll get the discussion going with the other mayors and the rest of our guests.
Yeah, I'll play my role by being even briefer than you're asking. I've been reading Neil and listening to Neil and sitting at his feet for too long, and so I find myself in violent agreement with everything you said. I will add, what I'll add will be reinforcement or embellishment, but I'd like to underscore a few points. If you go to any Federal Reserve Board regional office and you ask them to describe for you the job production patterns of the past 10 or 20 years and whatever forecast they have for the next 10 years, I can assure you, whatever region you go to, you'll find a similar pattern. That in fact, what Neil says is documented by every index that we have, that in fact, the economy moves regionally throughout the world. Jane Jacobs, really, Neil's work is a very nice extension of cities and the creation of cities that Jane Jacobs has written about for a generation. Now, it seems to me that tells all the new mayors real clearly what I think Mayor Archer recognized, at least during his campaign, articulated, and that is any strategies that are going to aimed at bringing the good things that can come from economic growth to the people of central cities has got to connect up with that growth. Minneapolis, St. Paul, the next 10 years, 90% of the jobs in Minneapolis is considered a very lively place. 90% of the jobs in Minneapolis, St. Paul are going to be outside the central cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul. That pattern will continue. One of the risks, and I know I'm getting into I'm going to talk more intimately later to the new mayors. I'm getting into a little bit of the ministerial admonition to you. But one of the great temptations when you're mayor and you're working so hard and so closely with your problems is that you will tend to overlook the overwhelming fact that to the extent you connect up those opportunities for your people to that growth, you're going to be doing a lot more good than even immense changes that you seem to see right at your doorstep. I think we've got to change our vocabulary. I think Neil and Orfield and David Rusk has written on this very well. We have to change our vocabularies and not talk about urban versus suburb. We've got to start using a vocabulary that acknowledges the reality. The political scientists who predicted 1990 would be the year of the suburbs made a major mistake, and that is they made monolithic the suburbs. They're not. So the inner ring of suburbs, I was in southeastern Pennsylvania, and I was meeting with folks from Mayor Murphy's city, and clearly there they're looking at the regionalization of tax strategies and the rest. There is no question about that. The second thing, and then I'll close, that I'd like to see us be a lot smarter at and better at is I'm now on a panel that the Ford Foundation has sponsored to examine the connection between economic development and workforce development. which are two different phenomena. And we're not finding any real evidence of that coordination occurring anywhere. It's going to cost Ford a lot of money to come to that conclusion, but I'm giving it to you for free now, early. And I can tell you that in 14 years as mayor of St. Paul, that among my long litany of failures at the top is that I never was able to connect up economic development with the folks who are most thoroughly out of work and out of touch with it. And I'm not saying there are not some programs that we can point to, but as a whole pattern of urban redevelopment, we haven't been able to capture the economic development for the benefit of the people who are the hardcore unemployed. And so I would hope that we would all bend our efforts and our thinking to forging that connection in much better ways. And we know from Lee Shore and lots of other people here at Harvard that in fact there are models which combine human service support systems with job opportunities that really work finally, that without giving the support in the human service side, we're not going to be doing very well at providing jobs for the hardcore unemployed.
Thank you, George.
I would suggest that as Neil started out with his imaginary spaceship coming down to Earth, that as a practical matter, if somehow overnight all of the freeway signs were removed from this great city and its suburban areas, and all of the boundary lines saying you're now entering into Boston or entering into whatever, that you today, or we today, live in areas or regions that you would find geographically a sense of a continuation of a very large city. Housing, entertainment centers, the street lights, freeway systems, you would think that you're all in just one area. The thing that makes it different is if they put the boundaries back up or put the freeway signs up and you know exactly where you're going and then you interlock into that. But if they did remove the signs and you wanted to know where reality happens to be, just stop and ask somebody, where's the school board? Is there one central school board? And you'll find that in this area or in any large urban area surrounded by a central city like Chicago or Detroit, that there will be a large number of school boards in this same large geographic area. And so there are differences, and there are different governmental entities. I do believe that, speaking only for the city of Detroit and not for other cities, that there is a real opportunity for regional cooperation, at least on two issues. One would be a consideration of a merger between the Detroit bus system and the suburban bus system, because there's a need to have a better bus transportation system in our region, which would indeed, in my opinion, would lead to the probability of being attractive to the federal government that would allow the regional area of Detroit, which is the sixth largest region in the United States, to have a mass transit or a rapid transit system. We're the only large regional area out of about 20 major cities that has no regional or mass transit transportation system. And having said that, it is my belief that we will begin to cooperate with each other. It is in our best interest because, you see, our competition is not between the city of Detroit and its suburban communities. Our competition happens to be with Detroit as a central city and a region competing against the Boston region or the Philadelphia region or the Chicago region or the Cleveland region, and that's our competition. And as we begin to focus in on the 21st century, we need to embrace the opportunities to cooperate wherever possible. And I do agree, by and large, with Neil's analysis that the health of a region and its suburbs is directly related to the health of its central city. Anytime a central city like the city of Detroit has problems, and if it has an image that is not in the best interest of its citizens who live in the city or its surrounding regions, it impacts upon the entire region. It impacts upon the ability to compete It impacts upon its ability, whether one lives in any of our suburban regions, to attract the kind of workforce to come to the city, whether it's new graduates coming out of colleges or universities or lateral hires. So it's really in our best interest. And Neil, when you start talking about urban sprawl, I think it's in our best interest to not to run away from problems, but let's spend the time solving them. Because as we approach the early 21st century, whether it's 2010 or 2020, or as we get to 2050, I think what we will find, if we keep paving over good quality farmland, where are we going to grow the food that's going to be necessary to feed the larger areas of all of us? And so every time we run away from a central city that was the birthplace for a number of industrial businesses that have either moved to a suburban area or frankly have gone out of business, if we don't work together as a state and the federal government to solve the environmental problems that these businesses have left with the city and not purposely leaving those environmental problems, and there's a rush to go out to greener pastures so that you don't have that kind of environmental problem that impedes the financial institutions for loaning or investing in different problems, then it seems to me we're going to pave over good farmland and other areas that will impact upon whatever future we may have. And if crime is the reason, as you mentioned, for many to desert our large urban areas, might I suggest respectfully that given time, unless we as a society begin to deal with the underlying issues that deal with crime, such as the quality of public education for our children and the opportunity to provide jobs and economic opportunity for adults, then you can run, but you cannot hide from crime, because eventually it is going to follow into the suburban communities and into the next suburban community, and it will be something that will follow continuously. So we must address, I think, those issues. And then on a final note, at least for the city of Detroit, I do not, Neil, in the foreseeable future, at least in my political lifetime, I do not foresee a regional form of government, much like you might see, say, in Indianapolis or some other location. But I do believe, and I do and will support and encourage a regional cooperation between city and suburbs on those areas of mutual concern, whether it happens to be the funding of cultural arts, which is a proposal that is talked about in the city of Detroit and its suburban communities to fund the cultural arts in all of our region through a modest dedicated tax. But I do not, frankly, foresee a regional form of government where you elect one individual to lead that area. But it is, as life goes on, something that I'm sure will be the issue of many debates.
Thank you very much, Dennis and George. Now we're ready to take your questions and comments. There are two microphones here on the floor. If you'd go to those, please, we'd appreciate that. Neil and I both, just as a footnote, perhaps, Neil and I both participated in something the German Marshall Fund recently funded, which was called the State of the Cities Report. They looked at Atlanta, Chicago, Glasgow, Frankfurt, Rotterdam, and Toronto. And the quote that leads off that report I thought was particularly compelling and a strong message to these places, these urban places. They said in this report that more than 80% of the productive capacity of West Europe, Canada, and the United States is in urban areas, and that political leaders on both sides of the Atlantic make a grave mistake if they continue to duck the growing human and economic problems located in their cities. Truly, those are the words of the language of economics, as well as the language of early warning, it seems to me. We'll begin right here. And please just quick your name, and let's get as many questions in as we can.
Yes, my name is Maria Nordhaus, and it's a direct question to Mr. Pierce, but perhaps others can answer it, is what can a mayor or county commissioners do to maintain the community activity or community groups that you speak of? And what should that relationship be?
That's a broad question, because there are all sorts of community groups that I was referring to, from neighborhood organizations all the way through to regional citizen organizations.
Okay.
Were you that broad in your question?
Well, actually, it's a question I'm trying to answer in one of my papers due this week. Yes.
His tutorial fee is $25 an hour.
Get a little 2-for-1 here. Huh?
I think, well, let me just generalize. Neighborhoods that feel somewhat empowered, as the word goes these days, that have some control over their destiny, with which the mayor can communicate and talk, are, I think, a real strength and not a thorn in the side, as mayors thought back in the 60s. And I think over the years, mayors have begun to see that the active neighborhood is their friend, and they really need that. On the regional level, which I also mentioned, there's a tendency on mayors' parts not to want to have regional organizations that go across the boundary. It looks a little bit out of control. It's someone else's playing field. It's not underneath, it's not in the political system that they have in place and sort of a hand on. But I think they would benefit from that, and do benefit where it takes place, because all officials in a metropolitan region are elected to constituencies which hold them a little bit in a box, in a trap. Your only rewards are for representing your constituency, not for thinking regionally. Therefore, if you have a strong regional citizen organization or group of organizations that are talking about regional issues and thinking them through creatively, not as special interest, but more on a general interest point of view, that is of help to all progressive officials, because it creates a counter voice to narrow parochialism, which is the only other political voice sometimes they hear coming at them.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
My name is Christy Cardy. I'm a MPP2 at the Kennedy School here. My question is for Mr. Latimer, which is, you talked about models of workforce development combined with economic development. I wonder if you could briefly give 1 or 2 examples that you were thinking of.
Yes. In St. Paul, when we started Energy Park, which was an ambitious attempt at redeveloping an older part of town, we got a $5 million foundation grant that would act as a connection between the hardcore unemployed and any new jobs that would emerge. We worked hard at it, but other than a handful of security guards, the place now has 4,500 jobs, by the way, and they had 87. So it's been a success in economic development terms. But other than a handful of security guards, most all of the companies developed brought in either some technical employees or the rest, and the bottom line is we went halfway through the $5 million and produced zilch. There are plenty of small examples. Atlanta, for example, had a model of minority entrepreneur program connecting up the airport development with MBEs. Unfortunately, the outcome of that has been not a large number of MBEs in the airport area. There are, Neil, can you help me a little bit? Another linkage example. Seattle, under Charlie, Seattle, San Francisco, and somewhat Atlanta got into linkages where, and Boston, where things were really booming, you were able to link up social goals, 20% Section 8, have some kind of housing, and they work decently well, but they rely on a really booming economy, and it's pretty hard for most cities not enjoying that boom to implement.
You want to follow up? You look perplexed.
Well,
I mean, usually when George explains something, that's the way I feel. But
you had talked about the sort of successful models that you could build on, I guess, was the point. And it seems to me that aside from economic booms, that they don't exist.
No, I'm sorry. You're right, Charlie. I was obscure again. No, I was saying that aside from an occasional program that had a very small outcome, that we don't have any examples of major city redesigns where hardcore unemployed people really entered the workforce. Minneapolis has been at it for about 2 years. I think they've created 58 jobs, and they have a linkage program there. I'm sorry.
We are going to get into it with the new mayors in our session, and in fact, I think it's on tomorrow, to try to bring some people who are doing rather small projects around the country, demonstration projects with small foundation grants, to try to bring some of those ideas to the attention of the new mayors, but I think George is right. There's nothing really large scale.
Wait, let me try one more at it. Lee Shore wrote a wonderful book called Within Our Reach that has to deal with models of human service development that work. But Lee Shore does not claim that whole communities have been able to redesign themselves and to revive themselves through a systematic horizontal change in the way people work and live, but that there are small models. I am saying that my observation and my examination of cities around the country is the same as true of economic development and job production and workforce development. That we haven't truly, we mayors get into the business of giving little brag stories and we get carried away with it, but if you look at the total numbers, we don't have a very powerful story to tell.
And can I just make a comment? It's part of the puzzle of the age where skilled employment and unskilled employment are diverging so broadly, and there are so few opportunities in the unskilled area. I do think that small manufacturing networks, which are operative in some parts of Europe, state of Oregon is experimenting with, you've heard about in the Pacific Northwest, may be a way where we get a group of smaller manufacturers that cooperate and have some combined marketing, business planning, promotion, and technical base of cooperation to do more with trying to create jobs in inner cities.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Gene Donner. I'm a graduate student at the Harvard School of Public Health, and I'm from a rural state, Wyoming. And this question is for mayors of like Salt Lake, Denver, Billings, Idaho Falls, and it's about regional health care, which is a very complex situation. Rural states have a particular problem because they don't have specialized health care, and I think it's an opportunity for regional cooperation. However, there's a possibility that some very fragile systems of health services in rural states might be hurt if you promote centralization of health services in major cities. But I wondered if there are any mayors here from Rocky Mountain cities, and if they'd like to comment on how they feel, how successful the promotion of cooperation among adjoining regional states and cities in rural areas would be.
Well, we have the former mayor of Salt Lake, who'd I think be happy to maybe get together with you.
I thought that was Ted Wilson.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. He's a former mayor, a little washed up, but he's. I'm sure he's got some interesting stuff. Or maybe he could get with you after, and we can move on and get the rest of these questions in before.
Thanks very much.
You're very welcome. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Andy Blavelt. I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School. My question is directed primarily to Mr. Pierce, but I suspect Mayor Archer and others have something interesting to say about it. I'm from San Francisco. I was working there as a city planner. And San Francisco has the benefit of an extremely strong regional identification. The 9-county Bay Area for a long time has been recognized by all of the citizens there as the place that they live. San Francisco also has, I think it's 109 this Bay Area has something like 109 governmental jurisdictions. And a history of failures to create any kind of meaningful regional cooperation, or even and extremely toothless regional agencies, even in the areas of transportation and some of the other areas where other regions have more success. That's actually sort of a preface that I think that's the obvious dimension. The obvious problem here is how do you get to regional cooperation, and that's what people worry about. My question is really about interregional cooperation, or this same problem, it seems to me, has the potential to expand. I'm thinking of the megalopolis. We're all familiar with the Boston to Washington. How do you divide up those regions? The same problem of the 109 jurisdictions in the Bay Area. And in fact, in the Bay Area, now the people are starting to finally really think seriously we've got to work regionally. We're already well beyond the 9 counties. Our commute basin goes into something like 13. So how do you prevent this problem from just moving one order up in magnitude?
with great difficulty. Your commute shed, which supposed you always think of a shed as coming down, now it's gone up over the hills, and the Central Valley is commuting into the in large numbers with very long commutes into the Bay Area. It's all very difficult. You know, there was a Bay Vision 2020 process that went on for the last few years, pretty much top down, or they tried to be, drawing the appropriate number of minorities and poor folks. A little bit too elitist, but they did work real hard at a whole regional agenda, and they did come up with a report that would create some more regional cohesion governmentally. The legislature just defeated that in California again when one of the San Francisco state senators, whose name begins with a K, got up and made an irrelevant argument, and it went down because no one understood what it was about. It's very sad because the people have been really trying hard, a group, to do something. You may have to start from the bottom up in a region like that, but they absolutely, the Bay Area cries out for cohesion and for some kind of vision setting and cooperation between the parts, because they are all integrally connected, and there's the spillover beyond the hills into the Central Valley is endemic of the fact that they haven't created new affordable housing opportunities within the Bay region while throwing away a lot of land for reasons that they don't need to. On your question of the megalopolis, when do you stop defining a region? You stop when it's reasonable. I mean, we have in the Washington-Baltimore area now, the Census Bureau has called us one. That still doesn't take away the fact that the people of the Baltimore community have to think about Baltimore and its immediate environs, even if they have some spongy areas between them and Washington. And Washington needs to do the same. Later on, you can have interregional discussions. But I think the megalopolis idea that it goes on for hundreds of miles, it becomes so diffuse that there's no way that you can get any kind of regional cohesion within it, and instead people have to take it in digestible bites.
Yes, Mayor.
Bill Haidt, Mayor-elect downtown Pennsylvania. I've, as past 10 years as a Vice Chairman of the Planning Commission, I've been preaching regionalization before it was a buzzword. I prefer to call it a city-county partnership. With 62 municipalities in our surrounding area, with downtown being the largest part, and 7 colleges in the area, I've heard some new things from you today, Neil, that said that colleges and universities are an important part of this, and I'd like you to expand on that a little bit, please.
Well, it seems to me that we invest a large amount of our treasure nationally in colleges and universities, both public and private, one way or the other. And that we are in a society in which we have this division going on of, Reich talks about it all the time, of the trained, the technical, the capable, the affluent class, but those who don't have the advanced degrees struggling to make it all in our society. And we all know about the tendencies of universities not only to be white tower, ivory towerish, but for the faculties to be only concerned with their narrow specialty and how they're going to get a promotion elsewhere. And they're criticized for not teaching, and rarely anyone brings up they're also not out there in the community. And I think the university should be a very public institution, whether public or private, and should be intimately involved in many ways with its community. If you ask most colleges and universities now, they say, oh yes, we're doing this, and we're doing that, and we're doing that. But normally it's a small percentage of their effort, and the pieces aren't integrated together to think strategically how they could be helpful. And if the major problem of American society is this coming apart of income groups, which has a racial cut to it, but not entirely racial, it's a class cut, educational cut, opportunity cut, and it's getting more and more serious by the year. And it's going to affect our ability, all of us, to compete in the world economy and of our society to be a decent one. Then I think that the institutions into which we've poured so much of our treasure should be thinking, how do we mobilize ourselves and our multiple talents to be able to, without giving up our disciplines, but still to address this important problem of our society in much more creative and strategic ways than they have to date. In a region like yours, I would mean those 7 institutions should be talking together. What is each one of them doing? Inventorying their efforts that might be related to economic development and social problems, and seeing if there's some other and more ambitious and interesting ways they could be of help to the communities where they're located. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Pat Reinhardt. I'm here at the Kennedy School, and I have a question for Dennis Archer. You have been looking at strategies to bring economic growth into the inner city, and I think transportation is very key, especially for Detroit. And I'm wondering, as a secondary, long-term and short-term, you've had a lot of your population depleted over the last decade, creating incentives to bring people back into the city. And in the short term, if you've looked at the radical urban development that was proposed this summer by one of the, I guess, city council members on basically roping off parts of the city and actually shrinking your inner city so that you had a smaller city to take care of.
That observation was made by Marie Farrell Donaldson, who is the ombudsman for the city of Detroit. We have a lot of vacant land in our city as a result of having lost 61,000 housing units between 1980 and 1991, and it was her observation between 1980 and 1990. It was her observation that the city might be able to save substantial funds by, in effect, moving the few homes that are in blocks where there's just 2 or 3 houses and maybe 2 or 3 homes on a city block in a large area, moving them into where there's a stronger neighborhood and just allow the grass to grow and everything to grow up and not do anything about it, not maintain street lights, etc. I didn't buy into that. I don't agree with that now. I frankly look at the vacant land and see it as a tremendous opportunity. We are not like, as David Russ would define, an inelastic city. That is to say, because we have so much vacant land, and 90% of it, frankly, is environmentally free because it is residential. It was residential as opposed to industrial. Detroit, in my view, is a developer's dream because that represents an opportunity for new housing, retail, commercial, industrial parks, or indeed we've got enough land to develop a technology park that can be supported by Wayne State University, University of Detroit, University of Detroit Mercy, and Marygrove College, Wayne County Community College, and the like. So I look upon what people see as a war zone and see it as a great opportunity. We can demonstrate right now, if you come to the city of Detroit, every new housing development, whether it's moderate, low income, or upscale, where people are buying up the property. When we build high-rises and condominiums in the city of Detroit, people snap them up right away. And so I don't see it as a problem. I see it as a great opportunity for growth and development that will bring jobs back to the city of Detroit, because as soon as you start building, whether it happens to be residential, commercial, or retail, as soon as you put that first shovel in the ground, you're beginning to hire people to put people back to work, and that's exactly what we need to do. And on transportation, right now we've got all kinds of jobs in our suburban communities, but we don't have a transportation system that allows our people who have great work skills, great work ethic, but they've been laid off due to the depressed economy, to get to where the jobs are. And that's the reason why I want to merge the bus transportation system.
Thank you. Tom.
Neil, I'm Tom Murphy. I'm Mayor-elect of Pittsburgh. I know you've been there. Well, your idea of regionalization obviously is critical. In my sense, it's a very good cocktail conversation in that I've watched the federal and state policies move very aggressively to supporting and, in fact, favoring suburbanization. Water and sewer grants, highway construction, where at least 30 years ago the federal government through HUD made some efforts to tie the construction of low-income housing in suburban communities to access to those funds. All those efforts at trying to integrate the region have been largely abandoned by every state that I'm aware of, and the federal government certainly. And the other piece of that question is that my concern is that the undercurrent of all of this issue of regionalization, as far as I can see, is the issue of race, of increasingly suburban communities not building low-income housing, not providing opportunities for lower-income people to get access to jobs and better neighborhoods becomes a major barrier to, other than superficial efforts at regionalization, a big difficulty. So I'd be interested in your comments on state and federal policies that in fact favor suburbanization and separation, and also the issue of how race plays into this whole thing.
Well, thanks for the easy question. It is true that the feds have done at times efforts to try and encourage more integration. There was an executive order also to strengthen downtowns, like there was an executive order under President Carter, all other things being equal, federal facilities were to go into the downtowns. And not much of that helped, and I think it was swept aside by the overwhelming move of the times based on other federal policies, such as the amount of money given for interstate highway construction and now outer loop proposals, and the continuation of the home mortgage interest deduction, which dwarfs by many times over any aid that the federal government gives to low-income people for housing. So maybe that's what we wanted as a people. That's what we now have in place, an immense set of built results and continuing incentives from the federal government, all of which make very small the federal efforts made so far or made in the past to equal the balance of the scales. Then you add to that, which you did in your the question of race. That's why you could say it's hopeless. I mean, the federal policies are set that way. People don't want to accept other people into their neighborhoods. You go and look around any American metropolitan region, and what the suburban housing builders are building are cul-de-sacs of monoculture, one single housing unit value on a block, because they will tell any buyer, don't buy in any neighborhood where there are other values of housing around, because it'll bring down the value of your housing. They're more expensive houses, yes, but nothing where they're less expensive houses. So we're not even creating the kind of neighborhoods we had before World War II, where we had a decent mix of incomes, neighborhood by neighborhood, and young people got to meet all sorts of other people. So it's ended in sort of a national nightmare. What I'm hopeful of, and I can't prove that there's a change, is that while this looks like a frozen lake, there are some things beginning to change it, rivulets of change. And I tried to refer to some of them: the workforce preparedness argument, the fear of crime can be also a weapon to say we must begin to create social conditions that aren't going to cause more and more crime and bitter division. The feeling that we can't keep on going in that direction indefinitely, and I think underneath it, in many Americans' lives, a yearning for a recognition that we are a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-income society, and that if we continue to segregate it, we're not having the kind of a country that we wanted to have. I've been watching the visioning process in numerous communities around the country, and reading a lot of what people write in the papers or send in as their reports. And there's a real desire there to have more mixed neighborhoods and to have a society that works reasonably well, and to have it more compact and to let people be able to walk someplace rather than drive, and to have communities that work as mixed communities and represent, you know, what America looks like, if you remember the Clinton phrase about what his administration was going to be. And so it seems to me that in order to push that new little willingness, or open door of willingness, we need to develop, market, and show off communities that have mixes of people from various races and economic groups that actually work, by putting careful effort into making them work the right way, and that the inner city lands, you heard Mayor Archer mention a moment ago, are perfect sites for new residential communities that are really mixed communities. And then, I mean, all of the positive things we can to show that it's workable and it can be done. And the more people there are in cities, the more people there are in neighborhoods, the less crime. You know how that goes. And then on the other side, I think there also is a regulatory stick. I think metropolitan regions need growth boundaries around them, and we need to oblige new development to be more compact. And I think we should have new zoning laws which apply across metropolitan regions, or at least principles that call for mixed type of development. So we stop using the American zoning laws to forbid us to build the kind of communities we had before World War II, to allow more dense and mixed housing, so we can sort of begin to rebuild some of the community we've lost.
We have a lot of people waiting, and I don't want to extend this answer, but perhaps we can talk later, Tom. But there are a number of initiatives, although the resources are not great, rewarding suburban communities that collaborate with metropolitan. Henry Cisneros is leading in that effort. Secondly, he's made it very clear that the discrimination that the Boston Bank Board has demonstrated, about like 65% increase in discrimination against African Americans of equal creditworthiness, and we're going to try to end that through enforcement. we're examining our position in litigation. We have a Dickensian posture in litigation, about 100 years of litigation around the country, all involving this issue, and we're moving ahead on all of those. So there are definitely programmatic changes with real dollars and rewards attached, and also a stick attached that HUD has always had, but it's going to start enforcing under Secretary Cisneros.
Let me just add, if I could, please, that I think for too long we as America have avoided confronting head-on the issue of race. Racism is alive and well in America, and it is not the answer to say that we're just, that in reference to urban cities and the like, references to low income, as if by definition all low income people happen to be ethnic minorities. That's not true. However, having said that, it is important that we begin to recognize as a country the contributions that ethnic minorities have made to world and American civilization. Because without that knowledge base, we live in ignorance. Ignorance then, in my view, breeds prejudice, which then leads to discrimination, and then we ultimately must confront the real issue of racism. If we could confront that as a country, as we are confronting the larger issue of yesterday of NAFTA, of health care and the like, I suggest to you that racism and race has been limiting the greatness that America can be, because we spend too much time making assessments about people over whom we know nothing about, merely on how a person looks or their religion and the like. And if we could bring in education to educate all of us about who it is and who we are, and what a great rich mixture of diversity that we have in this country, we will go a long way. But there is hope. And I mentioned, for example, the re-election of Norm Rice in Seattle, for example, that has, Norm Rice happens to be an African-American male. The overwhelming majority of the people in Seattle, Washington, that are elected to become mayor happen to be white. And the same is true with the new mayor of Minneapolis, where a colleague there was elected. So there's signs of hope across the country, but we have to build upon that and not be afraid to talk about the issue of race and racism, and let's begin to attack that as we attack other issues that confront us.
All right, we have these 6 questioners here, so I'd like to get you all in 12 minutes. That means...
Why don't we try to get the questions in all together, and then we'll piece them out.
Yes, sir.
Do it.
May I have your question as briefly as possible, and we'll get them all in.
Sure. It has to do with mass transportation. Mayor Archer was talking about trying to get mass transportation introduced more into Detroit.
Would you speak right into that mic, please? Just pull it down there.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the question has to do with mass transportation, and I'm wondering about the financial incentives for improved public transportation. What are the arguments being, at the federal level right now for increasing usage of cars? Is there really an argument that we have to, America's based on its manufacturing of cars, and we have to increase jobs, therefore we have to have more cars, that type of thing. And also, do you see this related directly to
this is a little question
our planning, or our more planning of our housing, and that if we have suburban sprawl, it's more difficult to have an effective and efficient mass transportation system.
I think we got it.
I'm a student at the Kennedy School here. It's been suggested that 2 of the very successful modern city-states, and Jerusalem, which could have gone the other way, it could have gone like Beirut, and Singapore, which could have been a lot more like Hong Kong or some of its other regional cities with vice and other kinds of problems, crime problems, which have not. It's been suggested that one of the things that was different there is they both had very detailed definitions or visions of themselves. One, the jewel of the world and the sacred place of 3 major religions, Singapore, right. Competitive, and we're going to be the place that does it right. That's my, never having been there, assessment of that. It strikes me that U.S. city-states haven't done much of that. Now, it sounds like maybe Seattle's done a little.
Right.
But we think we might be, the alpha wolf in a pack, then we're just about ready to be dead, or we're not sure, quite how we fit in. And I'm wondering if you think there's any, if this vision or mission could be helpful, or was it very strong leaders in those two cities, for example, not mission or vision?
With regard to Seattle, it was very strong leadership.
Yes. I wonder why you take that position.
Yes.
I'm wondering whether or not there's any skepticism or resentment of suburbs where there are elected officials of both parties, and I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and a city which, just using Pittsburgh, that has had a Democratic administration and city council for, I don't know, about 60, 70 years, let's say, and whether or not there's any perceived friction or skepticism that may hinder the goals that regions try to.
Great. Yes, Cardi.
Suggestion to Mr. Latimer. A program that I thought was very effective in the late 60s that Lyndon Johnson initiated to put the underemployed and unemployed men and women of this nation back to work was the National Alliance of Businessmen, Job Opportunity in the Business Sector. 6-month training programs, you complete the training program, and rather significant tax breaks and incentives for the corporation. It seems to me, and there's a tremendous number of men that are now in their 50s to 60s that are leadership people at the automotive manufacturing plants in Toledo, Northwestern Ohio, that got their start in that program. It was successful, had a great retention percentage, and it's something I think the federal government needs to take a look at. And then the other question really was the growing gap between, has been referred to, the skilled that will be able to be partners in the new technology, the new manufacturing, international manufacturing economy, and the growing numbers of young men and women that, by virtue of lack of education and training, are not going to be able to be a part of that. The federal government's got to take some leads, in my judgment, in this area of addressing this lack of education, lack of training, and I'm wondering if the Clinton administration and the Secretary of Education and others have any plans in this area. This, to me, everything this university is about is belief in education, and yet we've got growing numbers that just aren't ready to be there.
Thanks, Cardi. Bill.
Yes, I'm the incoming mayor of Rochester, New York, and where I would add very quickly that 61% of the population is white, and I got 71% of the vote, so I just wanted to put me on the list. Mr. Pierce, I know you know about our city, you've written about us, and I wanted to get your reaction to something. One of my campaign programs was what I call Metropolitan Solutions Without Metropolitan Government. You may remember that 10 years ago, we had a countywide referendum to create a metropolitan police force, which went down in flames. That was designed as a solution to our taxing problem. Our city was reaching its constitutional tax limit, and it was felt that if we could somehow take that off the tax rolls, we would bring some relief. I am slightly more encouraged about the prospects for metropolitan government than others are. And let me just say,
well, but can you just get to the
three of the ideas I want to, because I want to get his reaction, if you can, to this, that I propose, is redeploying resources. For example, one of my opponents called for adding almost 100 new police officers. We don't have the money for that, but we have almost 2,000 sworn police officers in Monroe County, which is a very small and compact county. So I talk about how we could redeploy even town policemen into areas of high crime on a short-term basis. The governor has done this by taking state police off the road and moving them into New York City. Second thing that I talk about is using...
You know, we're getting to 7:30. You
can I very quickly, I just want to say to John.
Real quickly, please.
Because what I'm saying is, the people who say that metropolitan government cannot work, what I'm saying is there may be another model, which is using things that people already pay for and redeploying them in different ways. And that's the question. I'm wondering if you have seen this idea work in other communities. Okay. And I can talk to you some, I know you'll be here tomorrow, and I'll ask you.
From your perspectives, how can cities better meet the needs of traumatized students who've been labeled as emotionally and behaviorally disturbed by the urban experience?
I guess, boy, that went right by me like a bullet. What was that?
From your perspectives,
yeah. Right.
In cities, how can cities better meet the needs of traumatized students who've been labeled as emotionally and behaviorally disturbed by the urban setting?
Okay. Okay.
Are you talking about young people, for example, who are being robbed of their childhood because they're more concerned about surviving the school day and surviving to become your age to even get into the
below
workforce?
the poverty line children?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, bounced around foster
There is a
homes.
major obligation to do that. We have seen, I believe, throughout all of our major urban cities, all you have to do is go in and talk to elementary school children. Go in and ask an elementary school class or elementary school from first grade through the fifth grade, how many knows someone who has ever been shot? I think you'll find almost 90%, if not 100% of the children raising their hands. Same thing with students who know where a crack house happens to be or a drug house. We as adults, not just cities, we as adults have, in my view, failed our children when children have to step up to a microphone or raise their hand and ask those type of questions. We as a society need to reevaluate and reassess what it is that we're doing and come together with a total community effort to put our arms around all of our children so that they don't fall through the crack. I bet you when you were growing up, you didn't have a fear about where you were going to go to school, how you were going to get there, and what was going to happen in your high school. But that's not the same now. That's not the same for elementary school children. They're more concerned about that. And it's important that we all reach out, irrespective of whether or not you have children or not, to have a commitment to work with our children. That is imperative. Because if we take care of children, guess what? We'll take care of ourselves, if you think about it.
I'm going to let me fire off 4 or 5 things that haven't been touched on, and I think touch on a few of the questions being raised about training. Some good news issues. I personally am a little frustrated that President Clinton hasn't articulated an urban policy, as did President Carter. If, however, we look at the different things different agencies are doing together, I think a credible case can be made. Very quietly, I think that the $215 billion that's being raised over the next 5 years from the top 1.5% wage earners, and the $200 billion, which is going directly for the earned income tax credit for the working poor people, I think is a marvelous confrontation of the growing gap between rich and poor, not unrelated to the job issue that was previously made. We ought to be more candid about the fact that we will continue to have hard-working people not make a very good living in this country, and we better make sure that they're not penalized for working. Earned income tax credit to the extent that we start acknowledging that every citizen has a right to medical care, that the non-urban policy issues together support more folks in central cities that have been supported in a good long time, and that should be reconciled. Thirdly, outside of my own bailiwick, Secretary Riley has had tremendous courage, has got the most highly targeted education bill been ever proposed, in which more and more of the education dollars, which are not sufficient at the federal level, are going to go to the most troubled, distressed, and poorest, what we used to call Title I in my day is now called Chapter 1 schools. There's going to be real targeting on the very poor schools. Moving back to HUD, we have about $1 billion, $750 million is going to go for large, distressed public housing and compact a $250 million crime program, which is going to go in those areas as well. So I think we can look to the next 18 months as a major infusion for support systems, national service and arrest, giving kids a little sense of hope, bringing a little bit more security, although I'm not a cops and robbers guy in that regard. Community-based strategies for security, I think, can work, and investments will be made in there. So I think that there is some hope along the lines that the last questions were raised.
On the issue of transportation that was raised earlier, money is available for mass transportation, and the fact that we don't have it in Detroit is not because of the cars, as it relates to present-day scenario. There was because back when President Ford was in office, he made available $600 million for transportation, mass transportation in the city of Detroit. but we were not able to, through city and suburban leadership, to come to rest on how it should be done. The mayor wanted, for example, a subway that went from Woodward and Jefferson, which is right at the river, all the way out to about 6 Mile or 8 Mile Road, and then light rail above the ground, and that folks couldn't come together on it. And presently, there's no working relationship between the city and suburbs that would give rise to that. That's the reason why I'm excited about the opportunity beginning January 1 of trying to forge the kind of working relationship that if we can demonstrate our capacity to work together to put for a regional bus transportation system, I believe that the necessary investment dollars will come from the federal government that will allow us to have rapid transit, and the urban sprawl and the housing, wherever it is, whether it happens to be housing in the suburban community or housing inside the city, will be, they will benefit from the regional bus transportation system.
I think we've heard a lot of interesting questions that relate to using our resources better in the society. The Rochester question from the mayor-elect had to do with the redeploying police officers. The question from Detroit also, there is local money that probably can be tapped for a decent educational system. The question we had about the education technology skill gap asked for federal money, but if a better use of the existing educational monies would, of course, make an immense difference. My feeling is that cities need a regional partnership in order to work towards meeting those challenges of using the resources, human and fiscal, that they have. They can wait for more federal government money. They can get some of it from time to time, but the immense challenge is to take the huge wealth that's within most every metropolitan region in this country and find ways to use it effectively through reinvented government, through more strategic positioning of the resources and application of those resources. That takes a vision. There was a question from Jerusalem about the Jerusalem and Singapore vision of cities. Wonderful question, which I really can't answer very well, except to say I think that it is not just people's, I mean, in that case you have religious, Jerusalem religious visions going way back in time and coming forward, but that you just don't have leaders. Leaders are very helpful, but in America today we need to have large groups of people who are both city and suburban, part of setting what the vision is and the particular hope and identity of each region in our country. And finally, I'd like to come back to my good friend George's point about all of the wonderful things, small, not yet announced as an urban policy, that the Clinton administration is trying to put in place, the earned income tax credit, a number of the other types of federal initiatives that he mentioned, and say, I think they're all great, but I think we need more vision from the president too. We need a president who says that our cities, newly defined as entire communities, are the heartbeat of the United States, and that until that heart beats strong and well, and we've cleared out the clogged arteries, and we found ways for the system of American governance to work where Americans really live. The federal government is a partner, but it will never be a heavy financial partner, or not as much as communities want, but it's the repositioning and reuse of our energies, and the federal government as a partner in all of that. But mostly the cities and the urban areas are critical to our future as a nation. I think the president also has to be saying that on top of his type of measures you've named, because the vision has to be at every level if it's going to work for the city-states where we live.
Let me just make one point if I can, and that is that if we can stop the filibuster that stopped the president when he initially started his urban policy plan, something that had not been there for some 12 years, if we could have stopped the filibuster, we probably would have been well on our way to having an urban domestic policy for distressed cities.
There's a lot that mayors of these really complex places cannot do, but there's a tremendous amount they can do, and one of the big tools they bring to that job is the ability to convene people, to bring people in these regions together. It's called leadership. A lot of the leaders of urban America who are going to be taking on this task are here with us at the school, at the Institute, and we wish them well. They're, in large part, the creation of that vision starts with somebody convening a conversation around a broader purpose at some table somewhere in some heavily populated part of our country. and these people are going to be calling that meeting. So let's wish them all the very best, and let's thank our panel for a very fascinating conversation. Yeah, Charles? Thanks.